Campside Media.
Hey, Campside listeners. Welcome back to Inside the Tent, a show where we go behind the microphone of our favorite podcasts and talk to the people who brought them to life. My name is Matthew Scher, and I'm one of the co-founders of Campside Media. Today, I'm going to be talking to Tommy Andres, the executive producer on We Came to the Forest, a new podcast about the fight over a controversial police training center in Atlanta. For years, activists in Atlanta attempted to push back against construction efforts. Ultimately, dozens were arrested and charged with domestic terrorism. Later, a young protester was shot, the first environmental activist to be killed by police in American history. The first 4 episodes of We Came to the Forest are out now. The last 2 will be rolled out in coming weeks. If you want more exclusive content or behind-the-scenes anecdotes from our shows, make sure to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. How do you feel about everything right now?
I mean, when something like this comes out, especially something where we're breaking news, it's always like a mix. You're excited, but also super nervous. As much as you check and as much as you go over things, and, we had fact checkers and we had like 1 million people review this stuff, you're always a little bit afraid, right? There's like some fear as a reporter, I think. Did we get something wrong? Are we going to upset people? You can't really avoid it, right? You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs, but it's still a bit scary. But now that we're like 3 or 4 days in, I'm like, all right, no one has called us screaming. We haven't gotten crazy emails. Mostly people seem pretty enthralled by the story. I've been getting a lot of notes from people saying that they've found the series, people I didn't even tell about it. And people seem pretty excited about this story. What about you? I mean, you're the voice of it. I feel like it's even more stressful for you to put it out there since you're the one reading the scripts.
Yeah, well, I'm the one who people will find first, right, if they want to express their anger. But yeah, I basically feel the same way. It's like there were 2 main concerns, right? There's the concern that you have with every project like this, where you're worried how people who you interviewed are going to feel about how they were depicted, or if they have qualms. And then there's the legal aspect here, where we're disclosing the contents of a investigation into the police who shot one of the protagonists of the show. And I don't know, maybe by the time this conversation comes out, things will have broken open. But in the meantime, I'm like, I have the same feeling. It's out. I can relax a little bit. While you're here, I want to read you this comment from one of the reviews. Oh, here's a new one. Okay, I'm going to read you this one and get your reaction. The title of this review is Silly Hippies. Although this is a 3-star review. Y'all will never impact change because your real agenda is not working and searching for acceptance.
It's interesting just from getting to know, I mean, at least I knew nothing about this culture of activists, especially activists who sort of travel to different causes across the country, pick up and move when they need to. It's just a really interesting thing to learn about those folks. I could see how people could take different things away from it, right? On one hand, it's admirable to see people with so much passion basically trying to fight against things that they don't agree with or fight for what they believe in. A lot of what Vienna talked about with the romanticism of this movement. But I can also see the other side as somebody who tries to be objective. And also, I'm not somebody that's in this world. So I can see, oh, okay, these are a bunch of kids that like seem aimless, go sleep in the woods, didn't end up really changing anything in the long run. I can see that viewpoint. I don't necessarily agree with either side fully. I think it's a cocktail of both. But I was curious how people would respond. My own friends and family have responded to this in ways that I was surprised about. But I do think that what the series does well, and I think it tracks along with our own learnings about the forest defender movement and movements like this in general, is that this is only 2 episodes in. Those first 2 episodes, like, you could have a totally different opinion than you have by the end of the series, right? Because you really get to know these people over several episodes. And I think one of the things about society in general right now is there's this very us versus them thing that is just rampant in society right now. And so you look at somebody like Vienna Forest, and if you're very different from someone like Vienna Forest, you maybe say, oh, I can't relate to this person at all. But I think if you listen to the series and you get deeper in, maybe it's surprising. Maybe it's surprising, right? Maybe you can relate to that person more than you think. But yeah, so I'll be anxious to see what people continue to say as we get towards episode 6. What about you?
Yeah, I understand that impulse to dismiss it as silly hippies or as young kids. I would say this: we live in this world now where people just, it's so easy to be buried in a social media feed or to do the ostrich thing and not think about it. I say this because I'm guilty of it myself. And the level of commitment it takes to be like, I am not going to be like that. I am going to actively try to change the world, even when I know people will dismiss me for being stupid or being young or having my head in the sky. I don't know. I admire that. I think it's people like that that do truly end up changing the world one way or another. And I'm always drawn back to this idea that movements have different parts. You're going to have a group that is going to seem outlandish or silly to a lot of people, largely because they're willing to put themselves out there in that way. And then eventually they pave the way for people who are in the middle somewhere. They do end up shifting the conversation in some way, I guess is what I'm trying to say, which ultimately does end up being useful. So I admire it. I hear you, though. I like what we were able to do in the show, where we start with this sort of really idealistic part of it and then watch when that idealism collides with reality or collides with the reaction of a city or state, because it is wild when you think about it time frame wise. It's like there was a point with this forest defender community in the woods where they really were allowed to create this world without much interference from the police or from law enforcement. So it was like, it really truly was an oasis for a few months. And like, you can hear that in the early episodes where it's like, this is going to work forever. But yeah, I'm curious to hear. So we have these two main protagonists, Vienna and Matthew, who represent really different parts of the movement. How do you feel now looking back on what they both represent? Are you happy with how that part of the series turned out?
Yeah, I think they do offer different takes. I think going back to your point too about just how broad this, like the Stop Cop City movement was huge. And we touch on it in the show, but we really focus in on the forest defenders. But like the thing is, there were 3 different facets of this movement that were trying to stop this thing with traditional paperwork and politics and those types of things. And none of that stuff worked, despite the fact that the resistance to this was palpable. It seemed like most of the city didn't want this facility to be built where it was being built and to the scale that it was being built at. And it still got built, right? So I will say, like, just to go back for a second to the previous point, this is why I'm like, in my own head, okay, maybe these folks seem ridiculous to people, but what was the other option even? Like, what, this was the only thing that came even close to slowing the project down or stopping the project, right? None of the other efforts, all the other efforts hit a wall first, like before this one even did. And they basically just threw away the referendum for seemingly no reason. So I don't know. I learned this diversity of tactics thing that was talked about with the protesters. This was one facet, right? The forest defenders were one facet of the resistance here. And they ended up garnering a lot of attention. And I think the attention game is also something that everybody's learning more about these days with Trump. And it's like the forest defenders, even if what they had specifically done didn't succeed, which I would call it a mild success. Like I would say that the forest defenders achieved some success because they did slow things down. They ultimately made the project probably more expensive. But I would say that maybe the forest defenders are the dangling of the keys while the other people are trying to affect political change in the background. And that's what we've seen happening in Washington, like over and over since in Trump's first term and now this one even more clearly. Anyway, so to go back to the question you just asked, what's interesting about Matthew and Vienna, and I think what's interesting about this movement in general, is Vienna said at one point, trust but verify, right? So there's the thing about a movement like this that is naturally leaderless, basically the point of it is to take anyone who will come. Like, we came to the forest. That we is everyone. It's like anybody that shows up will take. And there's some real risk in that, right? You don't know who you're going to get. And so there were people in the movement, I think, that were there for questionable reasons, right? Maybe they just like to burn things down. Maybe they just want to destroy kind of everything. And those people were mixed in with the real ideological people like Matthew, who had a clear vision of what he wanted. He had been really disenchanted, somebody who was a big Obama supporter and then turned, right? Like in Obama's second term, which he talked about on tape with us. I don't know if that ended up making the episodes, but so you have these extremes of people who really are plugged in and seem to totally understand this issue from top to bottom. And then people who just like, you know what, I want to take some shit down. And you got to figure out how to get all those people to work together. And so I think Vienna is not representative of that, pure anarchist, want to tear things down sort of person. But Matthew is from Atlanta, Vienna's from the outside. There's some differences there. But ultimately, these were people that got along and worked together to try to make change happen. I guess for you, like, you really got to know these characters. And I say characters, this is the funny thing about a show like this, right? It's like you're creating a story. These are real people. These are not characters, but we have to craft them into sort of characters to make the show, right? That's one of the things you have to do. So I'm curious, your thoughts about getting to know both of these people and what they made you think about the movement in general. What were your takeaways?
Yeah, it's funny making somebody a character, because I was exchanging messages with Vienna and she was like, it's surreal seeing or listening to this, because it is like you're picking parts of a person's life. We're covering months and months, but it's boiled down to points in a life that almost have to take on a cinematic quality, because they did have a cinematic quality. And I think she finds that a little discombobulating. But as I've said before, I admire both of them. I'm also struck by the cost of what they both did, which we get into later in the show. Cost personally, cost legally for both of them, costs in terms of mental health and reputation and their futures, because both of these people are facing charges for different things, but both of their names are in the public consciousness in a very specific way and will be for the rest of their lives. So I have sympathy for that part of their lives and that part of their existence, and admiration, and also a little bit of sadness too. I think it's hard not to view all of this under a little bit of like a cloud of tragedy, especially considering where we've ended up on a national level in terms of the new administration. It's like everything that Vienna and Matthew wanted not to happen essentially happened. Like all of it, all the bad things that they didn't want transpired. And I guess the one thing I will take away from both of their accounts, and I think about this all the time, is that there's the quote from MLK about the arc of history being long but bending towards justice. And I think that's generally right. But when you look at a protest movement like this, and Matthew says this in the show, what you really see is it's one step forward, two steps back, or whatever number of steps would amount to like a millimeter forward at a time in the long term, because we really do have this thing in this country where we allow a movement to change the culture, but then there's an immediate pushback. And Matthew's talking about that when he's thinking about the Black Lives Matter protests, but then it happens in all these different ways. Like it happened with Obama. Clearly, Obama led to the Trump era. In Atlanta, we had this activism on behalf of Cop City that ended up in the death of a protester and all these RICO charges and domestic terrorism charges. So that's depressing to think about too, right? That for every forward step, you get shoved back a little bit more.
Yeah, that's really depressing. So this took us 16 months, which is way longer than a normal project takes. This project also changed several times. Like what we were originally thinking we were going to do changed. And then, of course, several times we got new characters. Matthew came in. But the change, I think, was the biggest one was when we got all these files, right? We got the investigative files we were seeking. I'm just curious from your perspective, that was just a few months before we were basically ready to wrap this thing. I don't even remember exactly the date that we got our hands on these things, but we didn't have that much time. We had already crafted this narrative show, and then suddenly we had all this information that we had been seeking for months and months. So I would love for you to just get inside that a little bit and talk about that change and pivoting and what we had to do to sort of make the show work after all that.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, logistically, on a purely logistic level, it wreaks havoc, right? Because you're racing to incorporate all this information, and when you're doing a podcast at this scale, where there's so many hands on the product, it drags everything out and creates the chaotic close that we had for this show, where you're racing and you're hoping that you're getting everything right, and you're just trying to do fact checking and legal vets and everything at the same time. But then you also have to make a really big decision at some point whether you're going to try to weave this information that you're finding out earlier into the show. Because I remember when we first figured out that we were going to get these files, we were like, all right, maybe the easiest way, and this would still have been the easiest way to do it, would have been to keep everything intact as it was and then have the last episode be like, and voila, here's what we found, which is sort of what we did, but sort of not, because what we ultimately ended up doing was weaving through in at least two or three major ways that information earlier in the series. So a good example is this interrogation of the informant / journalist with the GBI agent in the first episode, which you decided to put in, which did require ripping up that first episode, but made the episode significantly stronger, I think. And then the music festival stuff is the other stuff that comes to mind too. We have helicopter footage that really brings it to life in a major way. And also, I guess, Sarah's arrest, right, where we were able to use the body cam footage. Is there anything else I'm missing that we added in earlier in the series?
Just body cams of the riots after Tortuguita was killed as well. What was interesting about this stuff that we got was that we got to peel back the curtain a little bit on how these investigations work, which I thought was one of the more fascinating parts for me. You got to see how the police gather intel on all these people. I mean, there were trash pulls. They were, recording people's phone calls. They were pulling phone logs. It was just kind of mind-blowing to see the feature film type feel of what was happening here. It was like secret agent stuff. But it was also a little bit sloppy. Like this stuff was just gathered and then it didn't seem well organized. We've watched these RICO trials unfold in Atlanta, several of them. There was the teacher cheating scandal, right? That happened under Fani Willis. That was before she took the reins as the DA.
Was that one successful?
That one is successful in that they sent teachers to jail. I mean, is that a success? I'm not sure. But yes, they did send teachers to jail and prison. Some got probation and big fines and that kind of thing. So there was some accountability there. And then they obviously have had two high-profile RICO cases between that one and Cop City. And there's been some smaller profile ones too on some gang stuff. But like you had the YSL one and you've got the Trump one, which are huge cases. And I think any legal analyst would look at that YSL trial against Young Thug and say that was a huge, colossal waste of money and resources. It took 3 years and Young Thug took a deal and got probation and everyone else basically walked. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see this one. It's going to unfold over years. It's going to cost a ton of money. I think a lot of these forest defenders told us that they thought that this was a way to just tie them up basically, so that the facility could be built. And then whether they actually get found guilty didn't even really matter because they would have had to pay legal fees for years and their lives are turned upside down and the movement was basically frozen while the facility was finished and the ribbon cutting was done. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it doesn't even matter if they get found guilty at this point. But I have real doubts that this is going to lead to really big convictions on a broad scale. 61 defendants. I would be surprised if more than a handful of them end up facing real charges, real consequences from this in the long run, besides the reputational and financial damage they've all suffered.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not naturally particularly conspiratorially minded, but I do think they're right about that. The forest defenders, it's not even a conspiracy theory. I think that is what happened. Maybe some of the state prosecutors thought that they could get convictions, but I think it was far more important to have a commanding show of force, to put these people under arrest, to get them into court, to be able to call them alleged domestic terrorists, to be able to remove them from the woods in any means necessary. Maybe we'll convict them, maybe we won't. This is a big group of defendants, and there are probably defendants in here who will be found guilty of something. There are people who clearly did do some stuff that they really shouldn't have done, but they're lumped in with this larger group to a pretty unfair degree. I want to ask you this, because I think about this all the time. What is the thing from all our reporting that frustrates you the most? If you had to have somebody from the other end of the political spectrum who was maybe like, oh, these are just a bunch of punk kids who went to the forest and wreaked havoc, what would you say? Like, yeah, but on the other hand, take a look at this. Are you not horrified by this?
I think what really struck me was when we got the investigative files and we saw how militarized and big this operation was. This whole facility is being built supposedly to train police better, right? But what does better training mean? And I think this is a big open question for me leaving this series. Does better training mean de-escalation, as I think a lot of people think it probably means, especially after George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks and the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020? Or does it mean better equipment, militarized operations like this one? I mean, there were over 100 officers that went into the woods with this crazy equipment, with these things called rooks that tear down trees and like stuff I didn't even know that the police had around here. And so to see that level of armed response to 20, as that reviewer said, hippies with no jobs sleeping in the woods, that's crazy. There's just no reason, as our analyst Steve said, what's the hurry? And there's other standoffs with people in tree sits that last hours and hours and hours, like just trying to get this person out. So why in this one case did they feel like they had to ramp this up so much that it resulted in a shootout? Because do I think Tort shot the police officer? Yeah. Do I think it was justified? No, not necessarily. But I also am like, what the hell? Like, this was clearly not well thought out. So I think the frustrations I have are with that. I think we can all agree that something went wrong there. Like, that should not have been the way it was policed. One thing that does frustrate me too is as soon as people find out that Tort had a gun, it seems to change everything, right? It's like, oh, well, Tort had a gun. Maybe they deserved what they got or whatever. I don't know if anybody says it that radically, but I feel like people think that. But we can't do that in a society where we've decided you can have a gun wherever the hell you want, right? Like, you can't draw that conclusion. You can't make those aspersions because it's just not fair. They were in a public park with a firearm. There's nothing illegal about that. Do I think guns should be in public parks? Absolutely not. But I didn't write the law. The laws exist and they have to be followed the way they are. So this thing about the police saying, well, these forest defenders were armed. Okay, so what? That's legal. At the same time, you've got the January 6th people. There's people that gather at the Capitol all the time in Atlanta with AR-15s strapped to their backs as a show of force. That barely makes the news. So that's part of my frustration. What about you? You obviously, since you asked this question, you must have some thoughts too of things that frustrated you.
Yeah, the January 6th thing, someone mentioned this to me yesterday. They're like, because they only got halfway through the podcast, they're like, "You're going to bring up January 6th?" And it was the first time I thought about it, because that's what I would say to people who are on the right end of the spectrum and who are really infuriated by this. Look at the difference in the terms of response to the people who literally invaded the Capitol and the response to the forest defenders who were met with literally an army. So look at that response. Look at what happened to Tort versus what happened to the people inside the Capitol. And then look at how these people are treated by certain parts of the political spectrum today. It's the people who would say, oh, how could you hold up Tort as any sort of hero? Well, how can you hold up the people who stormed the Capitol as heroes either? There is a connection there, and like how we see these people, and also a real discrepancy in how they were treated. I agree with you about the militarization. I think when that was cemented for me was when I saw the helicopter footage from the music festival, where you can, like, these helicopters that the police have here can see at a level that is shocking. Like, you would be shocked if any of the listeners were able to see this footage. To me, the worst, and we've said this a lot, is still the bail fund stuff. Just so people understand, in this show, the charges were eventually dismissed, but there was a SWAT raid on the house owned by a bunch of people who operated a bail fund that helped bail out protesters who'd been jailed. And they were charged originally with like money laundering and then put under this domestic terrorism RICO indictment and had to go to court for it and had to hire an attorney. And that to me is really terrifying because of the potential doors that it opens. If you let that go to its logical conclusion, it's like, okay, so one day, could we decide to go after someone who donated $100 to the forest defenders? Potentially, right? Like, that's the suggestion. Could the state go after someone who gave food or material support to someone who was participating in a street protest? Potentially, like someone could go to jail for that. And that angers me and frustrates me so much because it's like we are going to make it impossible for people to protest. When people like Marlon from the Salt Fund are saying, oh, they actually want to shut down protest by shutting down the means for protest itself, that's not hyperbole. That's what happened. That's what the state did. So that really, really makes me worried.
Well, in the meantime, they've been passing laws over the last several years in Georgia to basically further criminalize protests and make protests harder to do in general. The thing about this story that I think is really interesting is there's a saying that's like Atlanta influences everything. That's what it's like a local saying that people have here. It's like on t-shirts and stuff. And honestly, Atlanta is creating a template here. Just go ahead and do whatever you're going to do at the city level or state level, and people are going to have to deal with it, right? It's like, it doesn't matter if people don't agree with what you're doing. Just do it anyway. Eventually you'll build that facility or whatever. And then also, it's this protest stuff where they're cracking down on protests, the RICO charges, like all this stuff is being looked at across the country as 70 of these other facilities are going to be built, supposedly. So they created a blueprint for the facility. They created a blueprint for the response to the protests and political pressure. And they created a blueprint for prosecuting people. These are all things that we could look at and say, hey, this could happen at a national level anytime, right? Like the Trump administration, they've gotten snared in this RICO stuff themselves. So there's no way they're not looking at this stuff. And so I don't know. That's one thing. Atlanta influences everything is supposed to be a cool thing that ties to like hip hop and culture and all this other stuff, but it could be a little scary too in the wrong hands.
Some people in power decided that this thing was going to happen one way or another. And they decided it over the objections of thousands and thousands of people who live here, which is fine. Like, you can still do that. But the fact that it was just, we are not going to listen. We don't have to be accountable. We don't have to be transparent with any of this information. We are going to ram this thing through is just like, we have to live here, right? And I know that generations of people in Atlanta have experienced that, but like seeing it in action, someone on high decides that this thing is going to happen. And then it happens no matter how much people throw up their hands and say, please don't. And the city just does it. The city and the state does it. It's like, I guess why it disturbs me now that I'm saying it out loud is you'd like to think that's not true, right? In America or in Georgia or in Atlanta, that if a lot of people have objections to something, their voices should be heard. And the people who want to have it happen should at least have to explain themselves in public repeatedly and have to disclose the files like the one that reveals the truth of what happened to Tort, because that's what democracy is. And here it was just like, no, we don't really care how loud you guys get. And this applies to, this is like partially the forest defenders, but I'm also really thinking about the referendum effort on the political side, where people who are listening might not be familiar with this, but basically there was a challenge. Okay, you got to get this many signatures for this to go into a citywide referendum. The activist went out and collected the signatures, and the city was still like, actually, no, you didn't collect them in exactly the right way, so we don't have to listen to you. And now we're going to let this be tangled up in court for years and years until the point where Cop City is fully built. And then who cares what happens to your referendum? Maybe we'll let it happen. So I don't know, I'm getting worked up, but like, you don't like to think that could be true in 2025 in America, but it is.
Yeah. In the name of public safety, too, someone got killed. Like, they're saying they're going to build this thing to make us safer, and then someone gets killed. Like, just the ultimate irony or hypocrisy or whatever the word is. And the other thing, going back to the January 6th stuff and comparing that movement to this movement, the thing is here, there was a lot of destruction of property, the construction equipment getting burned, a police car got burned, windows got broken at businesses associated with this project, like lots of cost. But no one died on the police side. And we don't even have any examples except the shooting that resulted in Tort's killing of a police officer being injured that we could even find. I think a big point that the forest defenders would make is property is property, life is life. You cannot equate those in any way. So I think it's tough when you look at the scales of justice here. We got some bulldozers and other equipment that may have been destroyed and pickup trucks and that kind of thing. But when someone's killed, it just changes the calculation for everybody, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I remember reading when all the protests were happening in 2020, there was a book that was called like In Defense of Looting or something. And I remember reading it and like thinking, oh, this person is ridiculous, as a lot of people reacted the same way. And I still sympathize with my own viewpoint towards it. But it is true that you can't equate destruction of property to destruction of life. And that is what a lot of people do when they think about this on the city and state side. They will say, well, they were destroying things. I mean, yes, they were destroying things. And then maybe someone threw, like a thing that comes up all the time is, well, they were throwing Molotov cocktails at the police. Well, there were two people in all the files that we've seen who were masked and may not have even been part of the Forest Defender movement who threw a Molotov cocktail in the general vicinity of a police car, which I don't condone in any way, but that is not the same as sending a literal army of people with automatic weapons into the forest to push back against that. Those two things they're not the same. So I don't know. In some ways it's, I guess, reporting all this, I guess what I'm saying is it has made me a little bit more, I consider myself to be a pretty moderate Democrat, but in some ways it's pushed me a little left in some ways, just thinking again about what I said before about the proportion of the response. And also the thing that I will never be able to forget. No one listened, right? The city didn't listen and the state didn't listen. And not only did they not listen, but they were arrogant in their not listening and their refusal to engage with people. And I think this is something that people know. We talked to a city leader who acknowledged the same thing. There were mistakes in how this was launched initially.
That same city official said that he had personally identified several sites where this thing could have been built instead. There were plenty of opportunities along the way for city leaders to compromise in some way. And I think just showing just a little bit of compromise, even if it was just put the exact same thing in a different place. And I think that could have really tamp down the resistance to this. A lot of people were against this thing for police militarization reasons, but still, like the environmental plus the police militarization plus the lack of listening to feedback from the community, I think all those things really created this really toxic cocktail. And if they had just been like, hey, listen, we hear you, we're going to change this thing in some way that is meaningful, this all could have been avoided and Tort wouldn't have been killed. And to me, that's the big thing. And I think that's the thing that everybody that was involved in this movement wishes, is they just all wish they didn't have this martyr. They all wish that this person hadn't been killed. And I think Matthew Johnson said it best. He was just like, we hear every excuse made for police officers when a shooting happens, right? And these are the people that are trained to be in shootings. And then when somebody who is not trained to be in a shooting suddenly finds themselves in a firefight, and they do something rash and they shoot, suddenly it's, well, we're going to condemn that person immediately. And I think it's just an interesting, I'm not saying I agree with that point wholeheartedly, but it's an interesting thought experiment for sure.
Sure is. Thanks so much to Tommy and the rest of the We Came to the Forest team. And thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. If you haven't already, don't forget to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.